The fact that the Liberals are supporting a petition to go after the only company in Canada that consistently calls out the Liberal government is astounding. For the last 4 years, all the Liberals have told Canadians is how vital our news, media, and journalism are to democracy. So it may surprise you, or maybe not, to learn that there is now a Liberal-backed petition targeting Postmedia, calling for ownership divestiture because its journalism is deemed unacceptable. Funny how the concern for quote-unquote independent journalism only seems to disappear when that journalism criticizes the Liberals, holding them to account. Let's take a look. So this is a post by Ron Shields, and it says, e-petition E6821 to get right-wing U.S. ownership out of Canadian news now has over 2,000 signatures. If you have already signed, please share. Here's the website to sign the petition. According to the petition, Postmedia, one of Canada's largest media companies, is controlled by Chatham Asset Management, an American hedge fund, placing a key part of Canada's news media under foreign influence. Foreign ownership introduces perspectives shaped by American political and cultural priorities, which often do not reflect Canadian values or concerns. Independent Canadian journalism is essential to democracy, ensuring accountability, accuracy, and representation of Canadian voices. Foreign control risks skewing news coverage, undermining media integrity, and eroding public trust. And other countries such as Australia and France have established policies to safeguard domestic control of media, providing workable models for Canada. P.S. The Ottawa Sun is also Postmedia owned. So there's this graphic that is posted below this, and this is stamped by the social media account Save the CBC. Now, it's kind of correct. Postmedia does own National Post, Ottawa Citizen, Calgary Herald, Toronto Sun, Edmonton Journal, Vancouver Sun, the Gazette, the Province, and many others. And here's the petition itself. So, right at the bottom, we, the undersigned residents of Canada, call upon the House of Commons in Parliament assembled to pass legislation requiring majority Canadian ownership and control of print, digital, and other non-audiovisual news media to protect Canadian sovereignty, ensure journalism integrity, and guarantee that our media reflects Canadian priorities and values. Here's the Liberal in question, MP Vivian Lapointe out of Sudbury. So this opened on October 21st, 2025, and it will close for signatures February 18th of 2026. And as of recording this, it has 8,747 signatures. Now the irony, right under it in the comments, he says this: there should have been more scrutiny on the investment by Postmedia. They played a shell game shuffling things around to meet the Canadian ownership laws on media, which is actually untrue. Canada does have foreign ownership rules and always has. 25% maximum ownership. The rules did not change, but they are using a loophole to get by those rules. They formed Postmedia by an amalgamation of CanWest debt holders. These debt holders were primarily in the US. They left the debt with Postmedia and the debt holders primarily in the US. However, by limiting voting rights on any of the US-owned shares, they slipped through the foreign ownership rules. And someone follows that up. Yep, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is one of only a handful of global public broadcasters that remain with any shred of global recognition for truth and professionalism in evidentiary broadcasting. All others are bought. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not satire, this is not sarcasm, this is a serious comment. And the original poster replies, true for public broadcasters, however, the CBC is not totally neutral. There are more neutral sources in Canada. Having said that, the CBC does not lie. It presents honest and factual information. Following it up with, their problem is generally related to omission of parts of a story or the entire story, using loaded words to influence and not showing or telling both sides. Wouldn't that be a lie by omission, folks? I personally would like to see neutral, unbiased media, which is hard to find. While CBC is good, it is slightly left biased. So isn't that interesting that people that actually purport to support this petition that says we need to have independent media then say the CBC is great, but they also kind of admit that the CBC is biased. So what does this say? That even people that support the Liberals and are on the left can see that the CBC has a left-wing bias. Even they can see it. That was something very surprising to me in this. Now, it's unfortunate that this is being painted this way for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's not really true. And number two, I was there. Some of you may know I used to work in broadcasting. I used to work for a company called Alliance Atlantis Communications. And way back in the mid-2000s, Alliance Atlantis was bought by who? CanWest Global. CanWest Global owned all of the newspapers that became Postmedia. And I was also there when CanWest blew apart and Postmedia ended up forming. So I know what happened behind the scenes. And I know what happened through this whole saga. And we're going to give you a little bit of context so you know what happened through this. These people just want to say, well, you know, there were some debt holders in the United States and they took over. And then they want to say, and as a result of that, they're deciding what all of the media coming out of Postmedia is actually doing. Therefore, everything that we're getting from National Post and Toronto Sun and Vancouver Sun and all these other newspapers, it has a right-wing American bias because they're influencing everything. That's what they want you to believe. Okay, let's get to the context going way, way back to when Alliance Atlantis was actually sold. So this is a press release back in 2007. CanWest Goldman Sachs to buy Alliance Atlantis for $2.3 billion. Now, I'm not going to go through the actual press release here, but basically what happened is Alliance Atlantis was comprised of two different divisions. We had the specialty channel division, and then we had the motion picture distribution division. So CanWest wasn't interested in the motion picture distribution area because they were a news organization and a broadcasting organization. So they didn't want the motion picture distribution side of Alliance Atlantis. So what ended up happening is they split Alliance Atlantis into two different companies during the sale. So this was kind of unprecedented. How did Goldman Sachs get involved, you may ask? I'm glad you did ask. So one of the things that happened is when global television actually started and grew across Canada, that was done by a man named Izzy Asper, which you may know. Now, he had a couple of sons, David and Leonard, and the trouble with that is they were born with the silver spoon way up their mouth and down their throat. So when Leonard took over the company after Izzy passed away, Leonard went on a spending spree. He started buying up every newspaper he could and even foreign radio stations. He actually bought one in Australia. So the issue is when companies end up buying all of these companies, they take on debt. And they took on a lot of debt. And when it came around the time of Alliance Atlantis, behind the scenes, this is actually what happened. So Alliance Atlantis had grown into a very profitable broadcaster, had a strong stable of specialty channels, had the motion picture distribution side for Canada, so it was in a pretty good spot. It was trading at around $53, $54 a share, which was pretty decent at the time. And we had offices in Madrid, in London, the United States, and the US. So when this actually came to be, Alliance Atlantis realized that organically they couldn't really grow anymore. So they started looking around. And they actually approached CanWest Global about purchasing them. Now the context here is this. Alliance Atlantis Communication had about 1,500 employees at the time. CanWest Global had 11,000 employees all across Canada. And Alliance Atlantis, from a debt perspective, actually had more money than CanWest Global because they were running their business properly. So Alliance Atlantis actually approached CanWest about that, and then CanWest went away and turned around and said, how about we buy you instead, and we'll pay you this price. And it was a ridiculous price. So the Alliance Atlantis executives got together and they said, okay, thank you very much. Because they all had, very large amounts of shares and controlling ownership. And CanWest was basically going to say, we'll give you the sticker price. So if you're an executive, you're saying, sure, no problem. We weren't thinking of selling, but if you're going to do that, thank you very much. The problem is that when that happened, CanWest Global needed additional financing because they were already billions of dollars in debt already, right? So they went to every Canadian lender, and none of the banks, none of the lenders would give them any more money because they said it's too risky. You're going to collapse under the debt if you buy this, because the sticker price was going to be for around $2.3 billion. So rather than maybe do the responsible thing and say, well, guys, maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe it's too risky. We should listen to the banks and the evaluation of our investment profile. No. They decided to go to the United States, and they went to a company called Goldman Sachs, which is a money printing machine. Rather, money making machine, I should say. So Goldman Sachs said, sure, we'll back you, but if you don't pay X amount back within X amount of time, we take over your company. And CanWest said, sounds like a great deal to us. And no, I'm not making any of this up. This is what happened behind the scenes. So then the deal goes through, and CanWest takes over Alliance Atlantis, and all the Alliance Atlantis executives start, laughing and leaving, saying, see you later. We know what's going to happen here. Well, as the merger and acquisition took over, we started to understand why CanWest wasn't making any money, because they were doing a lot of things backwards, and they weren't really running things very well. But, oh well, had to move forward. And move forward it did. But what didn't move forward was CanWest's stock value. So about a year later, CanWest, which at one point, before the sale of Alliance Atlantis, was trading at around $15 a share. Notice that was around $40 less per share than it was for Alliance Atlantis. But CanWest was trading about $15 a share. So, and about a year after the sale, it dropped all the way down to $2.18 per share. Now, this even cites that way back in 2000, it says that CanWest shares were at $18.55. And that was when it acquired the National Post. So the fact that it dropped all the way down to $2.18 about a year after taking on all of that debt and purchasing Alliance Atlantis, that wasn't a good sign. And it was even worse of a sign when a year after that, it was 10 cents a share. And this is a marketing stock guy back in 2010 rating the actual closing of the stock when it was completely dissolved at around 8 cents a share. I remember the day that we heard the news going around the office that they even sold the company jet to try and make the interest payments. We couldn't make the interest payments on the debt, never mind any principal payments on the debt. So the whole company just imploded. And then it was sold again to Shaw Communications, and Goldman Sachs was having problems because they realized that they couldn't actually take over a Canadian company. The laws wouldn't allow it. And they need to figure all this out. So what happened next? Well, CanWest entered bankruptcy protection in late 2009 because they couldn't do anything and they were restructuring the debt. And even then, Leonard Asper was trying to say, oh, this is going to be fine. We're going to make it through this. Yeah, no, that's not what happened. And then throughout all of the problems that they were having dealing with the debt positions and ownership and all of that, CanWest was separated into CanWest Media, or CW Media. That was sold off to Shaw Communications, and the newspaper side was completely separated from broadcasting. Let me tell you how great that was from an IT perspective, which I had the privilege of being one of the leads on that and running the entire migration. But that's another story for another day. So Chatham Asset Management, a American firm, acquired 65% of all of the shares of Postmedia. Now, this is important because what ended up happening is, according to Canadian law, you can't have an American company owning majority voting shares. And this is where this gets back to the petition, because what ended up happening is Postmedia ended up selling all of the debt that they had and almost converting that into shares to this American company. So what ended up happening is, because only Canadian ownership can convert debt into voting shares, what Chatham Asset Management needed to settle for is 65% of ownership, but none of those are voting shares. I think they have only 25% of voting shares, something like that. So any major votes that happen on the board, even though they're a majority shareholder, they're not a majority controlling shareholder. And this is where all this kind of comes into place. But all of this doesn't really address the issue. We can have a conversation of whether or not we should allow foreign ownership or not. That's one thing. But that's not the discussion here. The discussion here is that because of that foreign ownership, you have U.S. right-wing perspectives influencing and dominating all of the media that's coming out of Postmedia's newspapers. And there's no proof of that. None at all. The one thing that there is proof of is that Postmedia is actually transparent. Because in one of the recent elections, National Post declared that they were kind of backing the narrative of the Conservatives, which is rather something extraordinary, because you can criticize them for not being independent, but you can't criticize them for showing integrity in that they're being transparent. They declared their bias. So you at least know which way that they were going to be leaning. But not when it comes to the rest of the Canadian media. And this is what we find fascinating, because the Liberals jump up and down about news is so important, independent media is so important, yada, 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 yada. But now they support an attack on Postmedia. They support an attack that would be designed to force the American company to sell and divest all of its ownership, or at least the majority ownership in Postmedia, and force somebody else to buy it. A Canadian billionaire, maybe. Or maybe gets acquired by Bell. Maybe gets acquired by CBC. Maybe gets acquired by CTV. Who knows who it's going to be acquired by? But just imagine what would happen if that were the case. And the petition tries to frame this as, oh no, Canadian companies, they're not biased. Not biased at all. It's the American companies, they're the problem. And we can't have right-wing journalism in Canada. That's a problem. We need independent media. Well, the Liberals have gone out of their way to display not only is news not independent, because, as we all know, 70% of the CBC is government funded, but they make it known that there will be consequences to media if they don't report favorably on the Liberal government. Remember this? September 2024, Talib Nur Muhammad responding to a National Post reporter criticizing their party. He says, your paper wouldn't be in business were it not for the subsidies that the government that you hate put in place, the same subsidies your Trump-adjacent foreign hedge fund owners gladly take to pay your salary. And the journalist responds, okay, you win, you pay my salary, I'll stop criticizing your government now, please don't fire me. Now, it was amazing combat by Terry Newman, because you have a politician basically saying, watch it, we pay your salary, so you better stop reporting bad things about us, or you may not get that salary. So, which is it? Is it journalism is independent? Or is it you're not independent because we're threatening you to pull our funding from you? Or is it you're not independent because you're owned by U.S. owners, even though there's not any evidence that the U.S. has influenced what's going on in Postmedia? Which is it? And never mind this, CBC got mad as well when facts are actually put on Twitter. Remember this? When Elon Musk posted this and changed the labels for media on X? Now, this is from a CBC article. CBC pauses Twitter activity after being labeled government-funded media, despite the fact that, that's correct. Latest move by Twitter to stamp public broadcasters with designations. And as you see, it says government-funded media. And then CBC posted this on X. Our journalism is impartial and independent. To suggest otherwise is untrue. That is why we are pausing our activities on Twitter. And notice that it says accounts CBC Radio Canada mentioned can reply. So nobody can reply. This is what we have here, folks. So the fact that the Liberals are supporting a petition to go after the only company in Canada that consistently calls out the Liberal government is astounding. It may not be surprising, but it's a whole new level of concern that we as Canadians need to have when it comes to this Liberal government and their creep towards censoring online media, towards controlling online media, to now controlling who owns what media in this country. If you want to debate whether or not foreign ownership is a problem and should we allow that, should we not, we can have that debate over here. That's not what this show is about. What this show is about is whether that foreign company is actually influencing the content that's coming out of National Post. And I'm welcome to see examples of that. But as of right now, seems like the National Post is just calling out the Liberal government. And they have even put out articles that say positive things about the government when warranted. That's what independence is. But they've also declared their bias. So everybody knows reading their material, okay, I know where you guys stand. It's far better than what CTV and CBC and the rest of them do. They say they're independent. You just saw from the CBC. Meanwhile, their own viewers, their own Liberal government supporting viewers can see the bias. So you tell me, which organization has more journalistic integrity and is more transparent with its subscribers? The government-funded media that jumps up and down and has a temper tantrum and says that they're independent? Or the National Post and Postmedia, who've declared their bias, but still try to act objectively in the reporting? That's the question for Canadians.